All right. So good morning, everyone. Happy 2023. I know it's January 18th. I hope it's not too late to still say that. But first time we've seen each other since the new year. And I'm excited to have the community back together, excited to start another season of EEConf events. You can see Julie Field has updated our styling with the new styles and designs for 2023. We're excited about what's happening. If you haven't missed it, well, I'll talk about it later. But we've got our fall summit this year already planned out, or at least scheduled. So let's get with it. All right. So of course, as always, EEConf committee. Everyone here is volunteers. These wonderful people who make this happen for us. So if you see them in Slack or Twitter, or you can buy something from their services, be sure to do so. Support them. We put in a lot of work throughout the year to help with these meetups, and then of course our spring conference and the fall summit as well. So definitely give these people some love and make sure to give them a big thank you. As with always, code of conduct is really important for our EEConf events. Essentially, as always, ExpressionEngine Community is, I've said this many times, it's one of the best communities I'm a part of. Never really see any issues, but, if anybody does try to sneak into our community or anything bad happens, you can always go to eeconf.com/code of conduct and report that, and that'll notify the conference team, and we'll take care of that as soon as possible. Catch us in Slack, in the EECMS Slack. There's an EEConf channel. You can definitely catch us in there. Let us know things are going on, questions you have about events, or just to chat. Questions, as always, I say this every time, and every once in a while we'll get a few participants, but Q&A, it would be great if you share your audio and video to ask questions, especially at the end. It just makes it feel a little bit more like a meetup versus just a webinar kind of feel. So share that audio video. And then one of the moderators will let you in and you can ask your question and chat live. If you're too scared to do that, be sure to use the Q&A feature. When you look over in the chat, there's two tabs. One is event, one is session. Make sure you use the Q&A from the session, please. That'll help us moderate and get through all your questions. You can ask them throughout the session. Put them in the Q&A, not the chat. Otherwise, they get lost in the chat. And then we'll have a time where TJ can either have us pull those up and go through them, or we'll do that at the end. Of course, our sponsors who make all this happen. Want to thank Hop Studios for, again, this is at least their second, if not third year as a gold sponsor. They've been a sponsor of events in some level for many years. Definitely want to give them some support. Triple Nerd Score. Of course, you saw Doug a few minutes ago. But he always is a great supporter of the community, participant in our events. It's a silver sponsor, and then our bronze sponsors, we got Greenline Creative, Creative Art, Jub, Prime Incorporated, Conflux Group, BuzzingPixel, Noble Web Development, and Bold Minded. Yes, TJ of BuzzingPixel with us today. So definitely big participants in the community. Friends of EE, we got Mithra62 with Eric. Appreciate all he does for the community as well. And of course, you can support us. You can support us either being a sponsor if you're interested in that. Sponsorships, this is the beginning of the year, so I got to do my annual pitch for sponsorships. But sponsorships are a year-long sponsorship. It's not just for one single event. So when you participate as a sponsor in EEConf, you show your support for the community throughout all of 2023. You'll be recognized at all of our meetups, all of our events, plus social media, emails, all those kind of things. So now is the best time to get on board with that. If you're interested, you can just ping me in Slack or email us at expressionengineconference@gmail.com. If you'd just like to give a one-time donation, we really appreciate that. Appreciate everyone who participates in the meetups and donates when you participate as well. A lot of people do that, and that really adds up and really helps us. But of course, you can go to the website and go through donations there as well. Again, EEConf, we are not for profit. We do not make any money off the conference or events or anything we do. It's truly a labor of love for the committee members. So, all right. So as I mentioned, this year's fall summit's going to be in Orlando, Florida. We got a lot of requests for sunny, warmer climate than Minneapolis and Philadelphia and all those places. So we're headed down south. We're going to go to Orlando Fall Summit. We'll be at the Rosen Shingle Creek Resort there, which just is a lovely facility. Lots of space, lots of fun things to do around there. Bring your families. Spend some extra days. You know, there's Disney down there. There's Legoland. There's Universal. There's all kinds of things to do down there. So we're really looking forward to a fun time. Again, this year the plan, we're going to have limited amount of tickets available, so be sure to grab those as soon as possible. Right now, we do have the super early bird tickets on sale, which save about $200 and almost $300 off your ticket price. So we only, I think, have 4 of those available, maybe 5, and I know 2 have already been taken, if not a few more. So we're running out of those quickly, and then the price is going to go up. We'll still have some early birds before we get speakers and all that solidified. So, but definitely go ahead and grab those. Go ahead and reserve those dates. Yes, Lydia just posted the link in the chat. Thank you, Lydia. All right, so that's all we've got. So today with us, we've got TJ Drapper going to talk about some Docker development, Blue Ocean development. Interested to hear that. What's going on there? I know TJ's been working in the Docker space for many years. He was probably the first one to really introduce it to me as far as more than just a tinkering around tool. First person I worked with that actually had Docker working in production and those kind of things. So I know he's been around it for a while. I know he's constantly evolved that process and how he works in Docker. Also, like I mentioned earlier, he's a member of the conference committee. He's also owner of BuzzingPixel that provides us great add-ons like Ansel. Has been around the community for many years. Can't say enough about him as a part of the community, as a friend, as a person. Just a great guy. And TJ, thank you for being with us. Thank you for being willing to do this. And I will hand it off to you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Andy. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, no. Microsoft Edge would like to record your computer screen. I might have to come back. Let's see what happens here. Quit and reopen. Yeah, Andy, I'm going to have to quit Edge and reopen it. So bear with me a second. I didn't realize I hadn't done this yet. So
no worries.
All right.
That's why we have the screen. All right. So always a good time. Who else is with us today? Mike, I didn't see you there. Yo. Oliver says, can't wait for Florida.
Okay. I think I've granted Edge the appropriate permissions to share a screen now.
All right.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, great.
I see a desktop anyways. Is that right?
Yes, I don't have anything there yet. I'm working on that. Okay. So just FYI, when I'm in presentation mode, it blacks out all my screens. By the way, you should be able to see my slide, Blue Ocean Development, set up Docker for Success. Yep. Is that correct? You can see that? Okay, great.
And you're good to go. I'll pop back on here if we can't see or anything. So
yeah, you'll have to, if you need to interrupt me, do so via audio, because when I've got Keynote in presentation mode, I can't see anything else. So so I will have some times where I'll pause and look for any questions on the way. You can do that, as Andy said, in the Q&A tab, or if you want to pop on video and audio, and then I'll make sure we have time at the end as well to do that. So as Andy said, I've been working on Docker for a number of years, and I think back about some of the first sites I set up in Docker, and especially the ones I put in production, and I kind of cringe at how I did it. So that's one of the reasons for developing this presentation. Is it feels like when you start trying to do the research on Docker, a lot of times you're just learning by trial and error, and there's not a lot of solid resources for this is the best way to do it for this size of an organization or this size of app. Then there's so many different opinions out there. And so the opinions that I have and the way that I do things now has just been sort of born out of trial and error and of working with sites over the years. And right now, I do a lot of DevOps for a company that has something like 60 websites at the moment. All of them are hosted on DigitalOcean. Everything since about three years ago, we have been deploying with Docker. So a large majority of those run on Docker. A lot of those are ExpressionEngine. So I have a lot of experience setting up Docker to work in both local development and production. So I'm here to tell you that Docker is the promised land, and you will never have any problems at all once you switch to Docker. Well, that may not be true. Okay. I can never tell when I'm presenting online whether my jokes are falling flat or not. I don't get much audience feedback. So let's talk about why anyone would want to use Docker. Let's talk about what the problems are that we're solving. So this may look, some of these logos may look familiar to you if you've done any development on your local machine over the years. Of course, down there in the right-hand bottom corner, some people prefer to install the tools directly and configure those and run them. I have done that in the past. It's not what I do anymore because I use Docker, but a lot of people use MAMP. If you're on Windows, you might use WAMP or XAMPP. Lately, there's Laravel Valet. If you're on Windows and you've been working in the industry for more than a few years, you probably used EasyPHP. Of course, there was Vagrant. I went through my Vagrant phase as well. There's a lot of tools, and most of these are all still available. You can still use them that make it possible for you to run your environment locally on your computer. And the problem you're trying to solve there is you have a bunch of code that needs to run. That as you work on it, you need to see the feedback of what you're doing. So you need a web server. For all of us working in the EE space, we're working on websites of some sort, whether they're application websites or websites that host a brochure website or anything like that. You're always going to need a web server. You need the backing technology. For me, lately, I've been doing a lot of Node work, but in our case with ExpressionEngine, you need PHP to back your website. You're certainly going to need a database. Maybe you need Redis for caching. You're going to you have a lot of things that you need to run in your local dev environment in order to develop. And of course, you have to run those things in production as well. So getting started on a project can sometimes feel a little daunting, right? Because you've got to get your production, your local dev environment set up to run, and you want it to be as close to production as possible. And perhaps over the years, what I started to do was you sort of had a dev script that would attempt to account for all the differences between machines and get it set up the way that it's supposed to be set up for the project. And of course, I still make use of a lot of dev scripting, but Docker makes this so much easier. So this Dilbert comic may look a little bit familiar to you when you get started on a project, spending 3 or 4 days just getting set up. And I'll be honest, the switch to Docker at my company was something that I actually, when I came on, they said they were going to have me work on. So when I got started, but in order to start on that, I had to start with the current environment, and getting set up it took me over a week to get, it's a pretty big application, several applications actually, and just getting all those environments set up was a huge pain. And through Docker, we've improved that process a lot, but this may look somewhat familiar to you. And then you have it works on my machine. Well, what do you mean you can't run our dev environment on your local machine? And then, of course, you have bugs that may happen in production that you're not able to replicate in your dev environment because it works on my machine. And unfortunately, we're not sending your machine to the end user. So that can be a problem. And you have to be able to have as much as possible the same environment in both production and development. And so when you deploy and some library or binary that was available in your local dev isn't available in production, production can break, and that's a really fragile way of working. And this is a problem that before Docker, I was trying to solve all the time for years. So what do we do about this? Well, we're here to talk about Docker. So obviously, I'm going to tell you that a solution, not the ultimate solution. There's never a way to eliminate every single difference between production and development, but eliminating most of those can be achieved through Docker. Because Docker is a way to package our applications in a way that will run anywhere that Docker runs. So when I was getting started in Docker, one of the challenges was just understanding the basics. And there's a lot of assumed knowledge when you start trying to, even if you're reading the documentation on docker.com, it feels like there's a lot of assumed knowledge that you would know what a container is, what an image is, what composition of all the containers looks like. That knowledge is kind of assumed. So I want to kind of break these down and kind of help you get a better understanding of some of these basics. So I struggled honestly for a couple of years to even understand. So we're going to talk about what is Docker, what does it do for us, and what are the key concepts. So I've mentioned this already, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. Docker is a containerization technology. It's a containerization strategy. So you're probably saying, yeah, thanks for that, TJ, but what does that mean? So to put it as simply as I can, in this context, a container is a package of software and all that software's dependencies so that application can run, so that software can run. And the goal is to abstract away the platform so that the application has the same environment to run in everywhere and every place that it may run. This was a pretty good quote when I developed this presentation some time ago, and due to the nature of the internet, it may not still be online, but so many times I've researched something and then the URL goes away. But at the time that I found it, Citrix.com had an article about containerization, and so they defined it as containerization is defined as a form of operating system virtualization through which applications are run in isolated user spaces called containers, all using the same shared operating system. A container is essentially a fully packaged and portable computing environment. So that's a pretty good working definition, if a little technical. And some of the things I will talk about are just, I've tried to boil them down as much as possible, but they can be a little technical. So if you have questions, please, as we go, please do queue those up and let me know. So containerization. It packages up the binaries, the libraries, the config, the dependencies, the application code. It kind of packages those all up and abstracts away that host, that platform from the host OS. And this reduces or hopefully removes the differences between environments and platforms that cause those hard to track down bugs. And it should be noted that we're not talking about a VM or a virtual machine, because Docker, the way Docker works is that the host OS kernel sort of provides everything that is needed. And this gives you native or near native performance. So if you've had experience with virtual machines in the past, as I have, you kind of you had to deal with a lot of those performance issues, and Docker doesn't have that problem, at least not in production. We'll talk a little bit more about, well, in fact, we'll talk about that now. I should have looked at my next slide. So containers run natively on native platforms. We're talking about Linux containers. Mac OS is not a Linux platform. It's not a Linux kernel. Mac OS's kernel is Darwin. So that's not a Linux kernel. And the same goes for Windows. The Windows kernel is nothing like Linux at all, though Mac OS is a little more like Linux. Windows is not at all. So some emulation has to take place on those platforms. And most of us, not you, Doug, most of us are running Mac or Windows. Some of you may run Linux, and you'll get production performance out of Docker. So Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows run a Linux virtual machine in the background. So a virtual machine is involved on non-native platforms, but it's all transparent. Or if you're on Windows, these days I think you can, and I'm not using Windows currently. I have, but that was before the WSL2 days. So I think Docker these days will use WSL2, which is the Linux runtime that is packaged with Windows for better performance. And you can do all sorts of things to improve performance. And in fact, Docker for Mac and I assume Docker for Windows, although again, I haven't used it in a couple of years, but Docker for Mac performance is leaps and bounds better than it was a few years ago. So we have the performance now on Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows that is perfectly fine for local development. Now, as I mentioned, I'm talking about Linux containers. Containerizing Windows is a thing, and I've even done it, but I don't have much experience with it. The project I was only on for a few months, and then I changed jobs and I'm not on that project anymore. So containerizing Windows is totally a thing, but I don't have a lot of experience with that. I'm going to be talking about Linux containers specifically, and that's most of us in the EE world. You can run EE on Windows Server. I've done it. I don't like it. Linux is usually the way to go, and we'll be talking about Linux containers. And just to be clear, Linux containers run on Windows and on Mac OS through a virtual machine, and obviously run natively on Linux. So let's talk about some of the key concepts here. So because we're containerizing Linux, you have to have sort of a base to start with. And so Linux base images start, they're predefined, they're out there on the Docker Hub. We'll talk more about that in a minute. They start with a very basic userland implementation of the emulated operating system. Again, I'm sorry, this is a little technical. You don't need to worry too much about it. Just know that the host kernel, it's leveraged for underlying OS calls. And then we developers use Docker files to create images with the libraries or files that the application needs to run. So a Docker file is really a set of instructions on how to build an image. And many developers have created many images that can be used as starting points. So you don't have to use the basic Linux implementation to start with. You can start with any other image. You can build on any image that exists that you have access to. For instance, at my company, we have this legacy application, and it starts, we were able to get it up to PHP 7.2. We have more work to do to get it beyond that, and we need to because 7.2 has been deprecated now. But we start with the PHP 7.2 base image, and then we build on that. So that's kind of where we start with, our Docker file says start from here, and then we have more instructions on how to build for our application. So I've been throwing around a lot of words, images, and containers, and what is it all? What do they actually mean? So let's start with images. So images are files that are created from that. When you boil it all down and get to the bottom, they start from that base OS image somewhere. So, and then Docker files they define the image, right? The images are built from those Docker files using the Docker build command. And so images are self-contained bundles of libraries and code. So think of an image as an inert, immutable file. It's essentially a snapshot that has, or it should have, if you've built the Docker file correctly, everything needed to run the application. And then images exist in what I would argue is confusingly named. You will find that with Docker. There's some messy history and things. Naming is hard. I get it. But it's a confusingly named container registry because a container is something else, which we'll talk about in a minute. So images live in container registries. Should have been image registries, but it's container registries. So a container registry holds Docker images. Your local dev environment, a build server, they'll have a local store or cache of images in its local container registry. And usually those are downloaded from remote container registries, or they can be built and then put in your local container registry. And then you have hub.docker.com. That's sort of the main default container registry, and it's where most public images are. In fact, as far as I know, it's where all the public images are. There are probably others that host public container registries, but if you're going to have a public image, you would put it on hub.docker.com. And then, of course, you can host, and this is important for most of what we're going to be doing, and mostly what I do. You can host your own private registries, or you can leverage private registry hosting services like GitHub or DigitalOcean. I've used DigitalOcean. I'm currently either using or switching over to, depending on which project I'm on, GitHub for the container registry and doing it all there. But so you have services that provide container registries rather than doing your own. So that makes it really easy and a great path to get in. And so then we have images, container registries. Now let's talk about containers. Containers are running images. So when you spin up an image, a container, sorry, I will mix up container and image. I'm sorry for the confusion. When you spin up a container from an image, that's how you spin it up, is from an image. It has to have that sort of starting point. And docker.com will explain it as container images become containers at runtime. So containers run from an image. I'm going to use a programming metaphor. Hopefully there are enough of you here that understand a class, for instance, in PHP. An image is like a class, and a container is like an instance of that class, a runtime object, right? So just like a class is a definition or a blueprint to create an object in PHP or most other object-oriented programming languages, so is an image. It's a blueprint for creating a container. A container is constructed from that blueprint, just like a class instance is constructed from the class definition. So we need to talk about an important concept. I call that concept ephemerality. You've probably noted that I say that a container is brought online from an image. So is that image changed or modified or updated as it runs? Well, the image is not. So unless steps are taken, anything that happens in a running container is ephemeral. That means it lasts only for the amount of time that the container is running. When the container goes down or is rebooted or is taken offline and then brought back online from its image, everything is gone that happened in that environment. So if you saved something to disk inside the container, it goes poof as soon as that container disappears. So if you need permanent storage, and we all do, right? User-generated content, databases, uploads. If you need permanent storage, that's achieved by mounting volumes into running containers. So if you're familiar with Linux or Mac OS, for that matter, Mac OS has the same concept of mounting volumes. Windows does it a little differently, but it's essentially the same thing. You have access to resources that are somewhere other than the boot drive. And so you mount those and then you access them through that mount point. And so containers have the same concept, volumes. Volumes are the preferred mechanism for persisting data generated by and used by Docker containers. So volumes are local file system resources from your host. So there can be files or directories mounted into the running container at the specified mount point, so that anything that you do when you save to disk or write something to disk or retrieve something from disk, that's all actually happening on the host at that mount point. I do recommend this article. Hopefully it's still online. Like I said, when I did the research, if you want a deeper dive into how volumes work. So that's how you persist data. And then there's Docker Compose. So when you're using Docker, most of your applications are probably going to need more than one container. Possibly not if it's very small. If you're just doing a static website, you may only need one container, but often you're going to need more than one container for a single application. And so Docker Compose is the way to do this. It is the built-in tool for defining a multi-container application. So it's an orchestration. You define all the things about your containers, and then you tell Docker Compose to bring them online. And this is done through a YAML file. For container definitions, docker-compose.yaml. You can include volume mounts in here. So, your commands for bringing Docker containers online in the command line, which we'll demonstrate in a little bit, they can get a little bit, you can have a lot of stuff to type out or remember. And so when you start specifying all these things in Docker Compose, suddenly you have a lot less to worry about, and that's all defined and can be committed to your project and travel with the project. I make heavy use of Docker Compose in my projects. Our company does at with our projects. So it's as far as I'm concerned, it's part and parcel with what Docker is. Rarely do I use Docker without Docker Compose. Sometimes I'll want to inspect a container or an image or use an image to build something, and so I'll do a one-off. But for applications, Docker Compose is the way to go. So here's a really simple example of a Docker Compose file. You start by defining your services array at the top here on line 1. And then each of your containers will have a key in that array. So for instance, the app container is what I'm calling this one. And it is just using the vanilla PHP Apache Buster image. So nothing special going on there. We're not building an image. We're just using a public image for this simple example. Port mapping is, depending on the strategy that you use in order to access, you may not need. I use a system called Traffic, which handles all that for me. And then Traffic owns ports 80 and 443 on my local system. But if you need to access something inside Docker through a port and you don't have something orchestrating that, you need to map a port. And that means that port 5000 on my local machine is now going to be mapped to port 80 in the system. So I could do localhost :5000, and that hits port 80 inside the containers network. So that's what I'm doing there. For local dev, that's kind of what this is demoing. I'm actually mounting the entirety of the code base into var www app. And that just means that anything that I do on my host in that directory that this project is in is reflected inside the container. Anything that happens in the container in that directory is reflected on the host. It's, it's mounting the code base for dev. You would build the code base into the image for production, but for dev, I'm just mounting the code base so that it's always reflective of the current state of what you're doing. And then I'm defining a database container. I'm using a MariaDB. You'll see here, I'm actually using what's called a managed volume. So I'm telling Docker down here on line 19, create a volume called the DB volume. Just store that wherever you store volumes that you manage. And then up here on line 15, I am mounting that where MySQL, or in this case, MariaDB, expects to find its data. And so that way, any data in the database is persisted across container ups and downs. So with all that, I'm going to demo this a little bit. So bear with me as I set up for that here. And then after that, I'll have a quick pause for any questions that may have accrued during this time. And then we'll continue. So let me pull up my first demo. All right. Well, we're still loading. What are we doing here? Okay. Can everyone see my PHP Storm window? I'm going to assume you can. It looks like you can. I can see it over in Edge there. Okay. So this Docker Compose file probably, it looks pretty much like the one that I just showed you in the presentation. The difference is when I went to run this, I found out apparently 5000 on my computer is owned by something else. So there was a port conflict. So I changed it to 5001. I'm still using that just straight up vanilla PHP image. I'm not building an image. I'm not doing anything to it. Everything else is pretty much the same. For grins and giggles, I threw in a Redis image. We're not doing anything with it, but it's super easy to use Redis in this context. I can just say, hey, I need Redis, and there it is. And then let's look at index.php. It's a real simple echo hello world. And then I also have here a PDO set up to access the database that I've defined over here. I'm going to access it. And this is going to fail. I'm doing that on purpose because I want to show you kind of how we fix it. Because this vanilla version of PHP doesn't have the driver for a PDO and MySQL built in, it's going to fail to connect. So I'm going to bring that online. And let me get a terminal over here. And let me go to the demo directory. Okay, Docker Compose, whoops, up. Okay, so let me explain something real quick. So you'll notice because I typed this a lot, it's wanting to autocomplete the -D there. So if I were to do Docker Compose up without the -D flag, D stands for detach. It would run inline in the terminal, and any output from the containers would be in the terminal, but then you have to keep the terminal open and running. And then if you were to do Control-C interrupt or close the terminal, then it would no longer be up. And so I'll demo that here real quick, actually. So you can see all the output from the containers right there, but my terminal has to stay running. And then if I do a Control-C interrupt, everything goes away. So if you do -D, it detaches and runs on its own without the terminal. So I'll go ahead and do that. You can see it started everything up. Everything looks to be fine. We'll do Docker PS. That'll show me what's running there. And so you can see there's the PHP image, there's the database image, there's the Redis image. So those are running. So let me hit, let's see here. Let's go to this URL right here. Okay, so you can see that we hit port 80 inside the container through 5001 on the host. It echoed hello world, and then we got that fatal error that I told you to expect, that we don't have a driver for MySQL in that vanilla PHP image. So let's see. Yes, the next thing on my list is any questions anybody has so far before we move on. Have I completely overwhelmed you? Why not DDev instead of all this manual setup? I don't know a lot about DDev, but so the idea of a manual setup like that's the idea of Docker, is that you define your environment and then you do it once, or update it as needed, and then you're done. So I don't know a whole lot about DDEV. I think Andy knows more about it. But yeah, I think I started before DDEV was a thing, and part of understanding Docker is not letting something else do things for you, or in my case for me, but actually understanding the concepts and what's going on. So Andy, I don't know if you wanted to come in and speak to any DDEV stuff. Maybe not. Maybe he's not online anymore. I don't know. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, let me see what's next on my my list here. Right, so we're going to solve the PDO problem with demo 2. So let me pull up demo 2 here. Actually, I need to spin down that. So Docker compose down. We'll take those containers offline, and then let's look at demo 2 here. So let's look at Docker Compose here. You'll notice now that I'm actually using an image that I've called docker-demo-02. Everything else looks pretty much the same. I've just switched to using a different image. And so in order to use that image, we actually have to create that image. So let's look at the Docker file that I'm using to create that image. So we're still starting. So with a Docker file, you can say from, and then you tell it what image to start from. So that's the same image that we were using over here, just using it straight up. Well, now we're starting there, and then we're going to tell it. So I'm using the PHP Apache Buster. Obviously, Buster is a Debian-based image. So if you know anything about Linux, that's a distro name, Buster. So it's Debian-based. And so you have apt-get, which is the package manager in Debian. And so we're basically telling it to install the MySQL client, and then we're telling it to clean up. So we don't need anything. Once the package manager has done its thing, you don't need any of these other things. And now the PHP image has a tool inside of it, a script for installing extensions. Normally, if you're installing extensions in in Linux in PHP, you're gonna have to do a lot more work, and you have to use make files and make install and all that stuff. And this does all that for you with a one-liner. I'm going to just tell it to install PDO and PDO MySQL. And up here, of course, in Linux, we installed the MySQL client so that the MySQL stuff on the host side is available. And that's really all we've done. And again, I'm doing this really to kind of show you how things can be done. You can get images that pretty much have whatever you want. So you have to decide. And like you said, DDEV was brought up. There's probably images for most of the things that you need. But if you want to understand what Docker is doing, and for more complex applications, you're pretty much going to have to build an image that has the things that you need, just like you would set up a server with the things that you need. So this is just showing you kind of a real simple example of how you do that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that online. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bring it online. Remember that we're telling it to use this image, but I haven't built that image yet. So if I try to bring it online, that's going to fail. Whoops. So you can see that it tried to pull the image because it looked locally and said, I don't have that image. Let me see if I can pull it. And so then it tried to pull it from hub.docker.com, and that image doesn't exist on hub.docker.com. So there was no image, so it can't run. So what we need to do is we need to build the image. And so I make heavy use of shell scripting myself, just because some of these commands, like I said earlier, you can start having a lot of arguments and things that you need to remember. And so I tend to create shell scripts that travel with the project. And that way you don't have to, worry, did I get all the commands just right? Did I build it the same way as I built it last time? So this shell script says docker build. We're providing it a build arg of buildkit inline cache. That just says build caching hints into the image so that the next time you build the image, it'll be a lot faster. This is going to be a fast build anyway, but for larger builds, this is a lifesaver. It cuts down on your build time when you're trying to deploy and all that stuff. And then you tell it to cache from, so get your cache from that image if it exists. You tell it which Docker file to use for its build instructions, and then you tag it in order to give it its name, Docker Demo 02. and then you give it the context that it's building from. So you usually want it to be the root of your project directory, and that way, in this Docker file, I'm not grabbing the files and putting them in the container. In the image. See, I'm swapping image and container. I do that all the time. So I'm not doing that in this Docker file, but most applications, that's what you would do, is then you would take all the files in your application and build them into the image. So telling it where to build from just tells it like you have access to all these files. That's your context. So that's the build script. So we're going to go ahead and run that. Docker build.sh. And you can see, like I said, it was a quick build. You can see here it tried to import the cache manifest from that image. Didn't exist, so then it had to go ahead and just build it from scratch. If I were to run that again, it would be even way faster. It was already fast. It'd be even faster because that image already exists, and so it'll just pull everything it needs from that image, and it'll go super fast. So now, if we do docker compose up, detach, it will bring that online. And if we go back here, now that we've built in the MySQL stuff that we need, if we refresh this, you can see that we were indeed able to connect to the database. There's no more error. I didn't show you the index.php. It's literally the same thing. I just took out the comment that said it was going to fail. All right. I think the next thing is any other questions or comments so far? I'll give you a couple of minutes here. I know it can take a minute to type some stuff out or jump on if you want to jump on video. And if not, we will jump in here. Let me go ahead and do that. So that's local dev. What about production, right? So everything I've shown so far has been on my local computer. And so we still have production to consider. Well, as you've seen, that Docker file is very powerful. Because it defines the environment that the application needs to run. And when you have a deficiency in the environment, you update the instructions for building the image, and suddenly you don't have that deficiency anymore. And if you're using Docker everywhere that the thing runs, then you don't have to worry whether the environment that it's going to has what it needs, because what it needs is defined declaratively in the Docker file, basically. And so typically for production, you would run a build in your CI. I use GitHub Actions. At work, we use GitLab and the pipelines. But you have a CI or your continuous integration server, something that's running the build. And then you push the typical workflow would be to push those images that you've just built into a private container registry. And then on the server, you pull a new image and then you run that new image. So I've got a really simple vanilla ExpressionEngine install, and I will kind of show you how that works. All right, give me a second to get set up for that here. Let me go ahead and just spin this down. And we'll pull this up. Okay, so you can see in this project, I have some typical ExpressionEngine files. You've got admin.php, index.php, your themes. I have, you've got your system directory. I have Tailwind, just real vanilla Tailwind setup. So that's going to be a thing that we'll talk about. It's really quite simple. It just looks at the template files. And then I'm using Tailwind UI to just threw a really simple page in a template. Here's my dev scripting that I talked about. So I use dev scripting. Usually I use a tool called Oakcliff. This is just literally just raw shell scripting. And I used to use this a lot more. So I just had this laying around. I pulled it in here. So if you go, let me get to that directory in my terminal. So if you do that, I just have it displaying the various commands that you can run. And in here in dev source, you can see the commands. They're real simple. You've got your docker up command, your docker down command, stuff like that. We may cover that more in a minute. And so here is I use a multi-Docker compose system, and I have the base Docker compose that defines things that are common to the orchestration of all the environments. And then I will also use docker compose.dev and docker compose.prod That's by convention. That's my convention. That's not like a convention that is enforced by Docker or anything like that. So here's your base Docker Compose file. One of the really neat things about Docker is that it makes environment variables available inside the container, and you can tell it where to load those from. So I'm telling it to load them from .env files, and then I specify the files. So I also use a system where .env gets committed and contains things that are going to be common and local. It has everything you need to run local dev. And then a non-committed file that you can put in the environment is .env.local, so you can override or change or add environment variables that way to your various environments. I'm telling it to use this image. So in my previous demo, it was the image name that we were using looked like that. And so if you don't prefix an image with a URL, basically, then it assumes hub.docker.com if it needs to try to download that image. If you use a container registry URL like this, that's my GitHub container registry URL, then it will use a different container registry. So for better or worse, the naming of an image is also wrapped up, and the concerns are kind of mixed with the URL it is located at. That's sort of the messy history of Docker. I would say those are a conflation of concerns, but it is what it is. So that is the image that we're going to build. And when you push an image, then it also pushes up to that container registry when you include the container registry information. Let's see what else is interesting here. I'm building a database image as well for this. I'm using MariaDB, that same MariaDB image, and I'm just layering a few things on top of it with the Docker file. So it's essentially the MariaDB image. And the MariaDB image, the MySQL image, and you'll find this with a lot of Docker images, they look for certain environment variables to set things up. So with the MariaDB image and the MySQL image, if you provide these environment variables, it will set up your database for you, and you'll be off to the races. You don't have to go in and then set it up yourself. I'm persisting data with the database volume. So we haven't talked about aliases yet. So Docker has its own internal networking. And then because I'm running a separate container for the database, then you have a container for the application. In the application container, you can't use localhost. That's the local container. And so you need to go out to the network in order to access the Docker network in order to access the database container. And so what you can do is you can define aliases at which you access containers. In this case, I'm aliasing it to this so that instead of localhost, I use this alias, and Docker knows how to route it when it encounters that, and it routes it to the correct container. So that's my base configuration. And then in dev, I'm just doing a few more things. For dev, you wouldn't do this for production. We'll talk about that in a minute. I am mounting the entirety of the code base, as I mentioned before, where it's expected to be in the image. That way, as I do dev, it's immediately reflected in the container. So I mentioned earlier I use traffic. It's a little beyond the scope of my presentation today, but just know that things like this are possible. I use a container called traffic, which looks for containers that have these labels, and then you can define things like, for instance, I've defined the host as this. So when I hit that URL, traffic routes me to this container. In order to do that, I have to be on the traffic network that I have created for traffic, etc. So I'm just defining a few things here for dev. And then for production, so I mentioned earlier, and I've been talking about Docker Compose. Docker has, and this is a little bit newer, so a lot of my older systems, Doug, don't use this, although I'm hoping to start soon. Docker has something called Docker Swarm. So when Docker is in swarm mode, it behaves a little differently. It makes sure containers stay online and a whole bunch of other things. Not appropriate for dev. We use Docker Compose in dev, and then we use Swarm, which uses Docker Compose files in production. For our purposes, it does pretty much the same thing, and so you don't need to worry too much about it. But it does take a few different configuration options. For instance, because when you deploy with Docker Swarm, when you say, hey, load up this new image and run it, it needs to know like what order to do things in. Like, when should I take the old container offline and start routing traffic to the new container, stuff like that. So some of that config is about that. In your application. Okay, so this is actually a utility. So I've added an image or a container here to my production config. This is just running vanilla Ubuntu. And it just runs a prod.sh script. That is the purpose of this utility container, is to run this prod.sh script. So this command says, when you start up, run, make sure prod.sh is executable, and then execute it. And I'm mounting the code base and my cache and my uploads volume in there. And so I'll give you a look at prod.sh. What that does is it runs a loop. Every 120 seconds, it makes sure that my cache volume and my uploads volume is writable. That's what this does. You can do a number of things like this. This is what I'm doing. This is what I find is the most common need that I have on my EE sites. And so I set up that script in that utility container, and it just runs. Here's my actual app config that I'm updating and adding a few things to for the application in production. So in this case, because we're not mounting the whole code base in from the host, we have to have a way to persist data. We talked about that a little bit. Well, here it is in action. I have a cache volume where cache is persisted across container restarts or when you deploy or whatever. That may or may not be desirable. I tend to want to clear cache manually if I want it cleared and not have it clear every time a container goes up and comes down. So I set up a persistent store for that. And of course, your user-generated content, I store everything in a directory called uploads in the public directory, and make sure that everything goes there. And then you only have to set up one volume for your user-generated upload content. That is the configuration for Docker Compose. What else do I need to show? Let's look at the Docker file for the application. So I mentioned that this has a Tailwind build. Whatever you're doing with Node, for instance, if you're doing any kind of front-end building, this is a great way to do it. So you'll see here that I'm actually starting with Node. I'm creating, I'm naming this part of the build the front-end builder. And so this starts from a Node image. It copies the application into its working directory, and then you can run stuff on it like yarn and then yarn prod. If you know anything about Node, if you look in package.js, yarn prod just runs this Tailwind compiling right here. And so that creates what we call an artifact that will need to be, because we're doing this in a separate build stage. This is called a build stage. That's what this is right here. It's not actually going to be part of this build stage until we pull that artifact in. So I'm going to go scroll down to the bottom. We'll come back, so don't get too worried, but I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and show you that. So we're copying from that stage the output that we did from yarn, from that yarn build, from Tailwind's output, which I have set to go into the assets directory. And so we copy that into our actual build stage. So that's what that's doing there. It's a great way to build your assets and not have to commit artifacts, basically. And so then we're building the real image here that we're going to actually create and push into a container registry. So we start from PHP 8.1.12. S6 is a little beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here today, but it is it's a way to start services inside of a container. So I'm using that and leveraging that. We're installing any of our required packages for the application. Here I'm installing PHP extensions that are needed for ExpressionEngine in the application. Because I started from a PHP image, there is no web server in this image. So I'm installing Nginx. I prefer Nginx over Apache. I believe it has better performance, and I like working with it better. I like configuring it better. So exposing port 80, because we're going to serve the site over port 80 internally, and then traffic, of course, does the routing, as I mentioned. Or if you're port mapping, you can map a port into port 80 in the container. Doing some other PHP stuff, like most of my projects, I'm going to be making use of Composer. You may or may not need that. So yeah, you can customize the things about your build. I install Xdebug so that if I need to do some Xdebug stuff, connect PHP Storm to a debugging session, I can do that. It is disabled by default the way I have it set up, because you don't really usually want that running all the time in production. It's a performance issue. I'm copying my Nginx configuration, so that's really just the site config that tells it how to run it and remove index.php from the URL and things like that. And then here is where, for production, you would copy the contents of your application into the image, right? So that's what I'm doing here. I'm saying take everything from your context directory, from your root directory, and copy it into var www. That's where I've set up Nginx to look for the site, is var www public. And so I'm copying that into the image. Here I do a couple of things to make ExpressionEngine happy. It wants certain permissions on its config file, etc. Here's where I did the front-end build. Presentations like this, I'm always trying to decide what to include and what to cut. The health check, I'll just cover this real briefly. This basically, inside the container, it tries to hit a route that I have, a template that I have called health check. And so what that means, especially when you're in Docker Swarm mode, is when you deploy a new container, it will not get traffic routed to it until the health check passes. So that, and because we're hitting an ExpressionEngine endpoint with the health check, we know that once ExpressionEngine is serving that endpoint, the container is ready to receive requests. So that's what this health check does. I'll show you real quick my template for that. It doesn't have to be anything other than return a 200 response. So I just have I have it returning JSON. And so that's what it's doing with a 200 response, of course. Yeah, and I'm using curl with fail in order. So in other words, anything other than a 200 would trigger a fail. So that's the Docker file for the application. I showed you the utility. So in order to bring this online, we would need to build that image and then run Docker up. It's a little bit longer build because I'm doing a lot more stuff. So I already have the image built. So, and you saw me build a smaller image earlier. So that's literally the same thing. I'm just building my images here with this script and building the app image and the DB image. Then here is where Docker Compose brings it online, and you can specify which Docker Compose files to use. That's how I use multiple Docker Compose files, so that I can have a base that has all the common things, and then if there's any divergence in the environments, then I layer that on top of the base file right there. And then we do the up-d flag, and let's go ahead and run that. Righty. So I gotta remember what URL I used. That's the one. So that's just hitting this template right here. Templates index.html. I literally just took a Tailwind UI page and threw it in here. There we go. So that's literally all this is. It's all it's doing is it's hitting that. If you go to, just to show you this is a real ExpressionEngine working environment, you can go to the control panel and do stuff in there. Now, let me go to, I think it's, I have this on my server. There it is. So this is running on my on a server that I set up just for this demo. So that's out there, and I have a deployment set up, and I'm going to kind of demo how that works. Before I do that, Sam, I should have wrote down the order of things I wanted to do. So this is my GitHub Actions deploy script. So, and you'll see here I have it set on push, on any push to main. There's various ways. You might have different workflows. You maybe can't push directly to main. You have to have CI pass first, and then you do it via merge request. But in any event, when main gets updated, it's going to run this this action. So I have two jobs in this action. I have the build job and I have the deploy job. The build job's responsible for building the Docker images, and then it pushes them to the registry. In my CI, I use something called BuildX. It's a newer build tool built into Docker, and it includes the native ability to push to a registry. You can see I'm doing that with this tag right there, this argument to push it to the registry. GitHub Actions, every action gets its own GitHub token that's valid as long as the action is running. So I log into the registry with the GitHub token because, as I said, it's a private registry. You can't get to it without a token or being logged into GitHub. So you have to log into the registry, and then you can push to the registry. And then down here, I'm running the deploy. So with this particular deploy, I tried to set it up as simply as possible. I need to copy just a couple of things to my server. So I'm using an SCP action. If you don't know, SCP stands for Secure Copy. It copies files over SSH. And so I have some secrets set up like my SSH user, my SSH host, and my SSH private key. And then with this action, you can specify source and target. So source is the files in your repo that you want to be copied. So I'm copying that production script, the prod.sh script, because I'm using an image and not a pre-built image of Ubuntu and not building an image. I'm just mounting this into, you may have seen in docker compose.prod, I'm just mounting the whole code base, whatever is available in the context of the project. I'm mounting that in there. Since this is not serving traffic or something, and you're not worried about performance in that way, that's fine to do with this utility image. At least that's the way I'm doing it. So prod.sh, we're copying to the server. .env, the base.env, which is committed, we're copying to the server, and then we're copying docker compose.prod and docker compose to the server. We're copying those to a directory called EEDockerDemo. And then we have this SSH action, which is going to log into the server and run some commands. So we're going to that Docker demo directory where we copied those files to, importantly, the Docker Compose files, because you need those in order to spin up a Docker Compose instance. We're logging the server into the container with our action token. We're pulling the images. And with Docker Swarm, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to pull this would check against the container registry, but it's, it would pull if it didn't have them. So I'm just pulling up here. It's probably a artifact of just feeling the need to pull those images as an artifact of how I used to work and how I do still work with a lot of my older setups. But in any event, and then we're using Docker stack deploy. That's how you tell Swarm to pick up a new image and make a container out of it. We're telling it which compose files to use. So in this case, Docker Compose and Docker Compose.prod. We're giving it the prune argument, which means remove older containers that used to be running that you've replaced with newer containers. With registry off means that it's going to look for and use the latest image that you push to that registry. And then we're telling it the name of the stack. So when you do Docker stack deploy, you give it a name, and then you can inspect that and stuff if you go into the command line on your server. So that is the deployment script. Let's make a quick change and deploy that. So I'm going to change that. Where is that? That's right there. Welcome to the EECA. And you can see that changed here in my local dev, but not on production yet. And so I'm going to commit that and push it, and that will deploy. So stage that. Add EECA presentation demo. Hit push. And let me go to right there. Actions. There is the action running right there. It should be fairly quick because the only thing we changed was some of the code. We didn't change anything about the Docker file or the dependencies that it was building into the the image. There I did. I almost swapped image and container again. And so it'll build that, and then so that's the first stage, that first job that I showed you, and then the second job is where it will log into the server and run those scripts. So while we're waiting on that, does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any? If you want to jump on video, and that would be the best way to ask the question. If you have any other things that you'd rather type out, you can do that as well. I see there's a question. What is an example of a single container or a multi-container project? Obviously, this is that question may have been asked before I started this demo. This is a multi-container project here. You can use Docker Compose for a single container project, and I tend to because I define other things like volume mounts and things. It just means that you have more than one container that is responsible for things in your project. For larger sites that need it, I would probably use Redis, for instance. That it's a better caching. It's a much faster cache than using file cache in ExpressionEngine, for instance. But for most sites, I don't actually use Redis because it's not needed. Most of the sites I work on, like I said, I work for a company that what they do, instead of building a smaller number of huge sites, they build a larger number of smaller sites, and those sites don't get so much traffic that you have to worry about stuff like that. So try not to over-engineer things, he said as he orchestrated Docker. So yeah, but a multi-container project. So most of the smaller DevOps stuff that I do is going to have at least two containers. One is your application container, and one is your database container. And as you get larger, you're working on larger sites, you would probably use something like a managed database service and then you wouldn't run your own database in a container. You might still locally for local dev, but then you would use a service that manages your database for something like that. So it really all depends on your project needs. Emmanuel, I hope that answers your question in some way. Oh, it looks like that deploy is done. Let's check out production. There it is. We deployed the new image, and when it was picked up, it switched to the new code. Any questions, comments, anything you want to know that I didn't show? I may or may not have answers. Would love to interact with y'all. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. Or I can just stay on camera and be awkward.
You just get me, TJ.
I get you, Andy. Do you have any questions, Andy?
Oh, so many. Let's see.
Oh, I see there's a red thing next to the Q&A tab.
Yep.
To emulate the hosting setup provided by my shared hosting provider, how would I find out all the things I need to install in a Docker setup? That is a great question, and the answer is not always so easy. For PHP, one thing you can do is put a PHP file on your server and run PHP info as a function, and then look at everything that PHP is loading. All the extensions, all the configuration. You can hopefully copy your config files for PHP and then put those in your Docker image to make PHP behave the same way it's behaving in your shared hosting setup. This is actually a relevant question because one of the first steps, and in fact, we're not fully on Docker in production at the company that I work at now, just because it's an older and very complex application. A couple of these apps are. And so we've done exactly that, which is we researched heavily our production servers setup, and then as much as possible made that into a Docker image. So that's I suppose that also answers one of the questions, which is why not use DDEV in our case, because we were trying to very specifically replicate what production was for our application. And then we have from Blair, would you call this a basic or advanced walkthrough of Docker? I would call it something a little more than basic, but not advanced. Docker, you can really get into the weeds on Docker. And a lot of this stuff, and the question of whether it's advanced, intermediate, or involved, or light. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. It really all depends on your vantage point. So, for instance, I would have found this much more closer to intermediate or maybe advanced when I started with Docker. But as you become familiar with terms, a lot of it is terminology. For me, at least, a lot of it was terminology. And so you're hearing terms that you don't understand. And part of my idea is to expose you to the terms, and then they sort of gel in your mind, and you start understanding what they mean. And then hopefully I think this is being recorded, so if you were to go watch this again after kind of sitting with it for a while and even trying to go implement your things. So this, and I'm talking about the way I learn. So the way I learn is, I've been exposed to this new thing. I don't know much about it. Let me go try it. Oh, now I'll go back and I'll watch again, or I'll watch somebody else, or I'll pick up something from somebody else. Like, it makes a lot more sense now. So it's sort of this iterative process. So whether it's intermediate or advanced, it's hard to answer. I was targeting like something in between beginner and intermediate, and really just to kind of give you an exposure to Docker and how it can work, and to give you a lot of the concepts. Do you find this method to develop a site, e-commerce, for example, a much more efficient way to build a site overall? Efficiency is all about perspective. So e-commerce, you're already off in the weeds, and if you can eliminate a pain point of your different environments being different, then yes. I would say e-commerce, you're eliminating potential pitfalls and problems, and especially my experience with e-commerce is always stuff comes up. You need PHP extensions. You got, this and that and the other. And if you can eliminate one of those pain points, great. If you're just building a really simple brochure site, and you don't have a standard way of doing things, it all depends on your vantage point. Because if your standard way of doing things, or you don't have a standard way of doing things, and this just seems hard and complicated, and you're just doing a single page site, well, maybe this isn't the way for you. But if you're doing a lot of sites all the time and you're in a workflow, then standardizing on something like this can be a long-term efficiency improvement, I would say. And so, for instance, the sites that I work on, where I do the DevOps on the side, in addition to my day job, there's a lot of sites, and none of them are huge. Well, a couple of them are bigger, but none of them are huge, and a lot of them are smaller. But because I have a standard way of doing DevOps, it's much more efficient for me to build things up the way they're supposed to be, rather than, with Docker, rather than say, well, this site we're going to run it this way, and this site we're going to run it this way, and this site we're going to run it this way. Like, no, doing everything, I say the same way as I also evolve and iterate on the process. So we have sites that are in various stages, but they all sort of have a common history and a common theme. So a lot of efficiency is going to depend on your vantage point.
TJ, one thing that's always confused me a little bit with Docker in production is, I guess you would say, like, connecting it, like if I SSH into a server, I can see my files and edit those files. But sometimes there's files that are being pulled in within the Docker environment, right?
Well, and
like how do you connect into that environment, I guess?
When you and I were working on Docker, we're working together, and I was starting to use Docker, it was a much different process than this, because I didn't understand a lot about Docker.
Sure.
And I even I waited to deploy to production until I thought I understood more, but I should have waited longer. In any event, this might be a good thing to actually just show you, show all of you. So let me reshare my screen. Let me actually pull up something here real quick. And all right, so let me reshare my screen. That would be screen 3. Okay. Share. Please share. What's going on? There we go. Okay. So this is SFTP into the server that we just deployed to. This is in this directory is all the files that I copied onto the server. So the rest of the code base is not here. I have my Docker Compose files. I have my .env file. This one just lives here because that's my local file. It's not committed, and I don't overwrite it. So that's local environment variables. And then I have the prod script. None of the rest of the code base is here. That's all in the image. The code base was copied into the image. So technically speaking, the code base is on the server, but it's in that Docker image. So let me SSH into here. So I have Docker running in stack mode. You typically wouldn't do this, but if you're having just huge issues, you need to troubleshoot something in dev, you can do Docker PS, which will show you all the running images. And it will look slightly different from local because I have Docker in swarm mode, but what you need is the name over here. And every time you deploy, you're going to get an update here. So this isn't always the same. So you want to do a Docker PS. This is my app container. So that has all my application code. So I can copy that and do Docker exec. -I stands for interactive. T stands for TTY. I can give it the name of the container that I'm trying to get into, and I can say run bash. So now I'm inside the running container, and if I do a list, I can see all of my source code in that project. The only thing that would be persistent in here if I changed anything in here, so CD into the public directory, CD into uploads, if I were to do something in the uploads directory, then that would be persistent across restarts. But if I change anything else in here, it would not be persistent. I just exited the container. I didn't need to do that. It would not be persistent, but you can, for troubleshooting purposes, I don't necessarily recommend you do this in production, but you can. And depending on how you have production set up, for instance, if you have a really heavy OP cache turned on in your PHP settings for prod, which I usually recommend, then any changes you make to your PHP files probably won't be picked up, and you probably shouldn't be doing this in production anyway. But stuff does come up. I have done it if you really need to. Because this is Debian based, you can do apt get install. Oh, you need to do apt get update first because I cleared literally all the cache for the package manager. So you need to tell it to download stuff. Apt get install vim. Yes, please continue the operation. And then we will go into, come on. CD public vi index.php and oops, var dump hello and die. I don't remember for this demo site how I have OP cache set up. So let's see if that will actually load or if it's going to load it from cache. Nope, there it is. So I don't have aggressive caching turned on. So that's happening inside the container. And that's the way you would have to troubleshoot something in production if you really, 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 really need to. The other option, of course, is if you have Xdebug built into the container, you can alter your configuration to turn on Xdebug in production, which again, I don't recommend as a general rule, but if you're really trying hard to debug something, sometimes it's useful. You can turn on Xdebug, figure out all the necessary hoops you need to jump through in order to connect over SSH or whatever to it, and then run some Xdebug. But that's pretty advanced stuff and way beyond the scope of this presentation. So. And I haven't needed to do it for a very long time, so it would take me some time to remember how to set all that up.
Oliver asks, is there a Docker for Dummies method, drag and drop rather than CLI terminal setup?
Probably DDev, but I don't know much about DDev. So, and it's an interesting question. It's a good question, but what I would challenge you to do. So we have a designer on our team where I work. And he gets in there in the CLI, and at first it was, hard for him to do, but he wanted to do it. He wanted to kind of be up to speed with this stuff. And I say he's a designer. He is a great designer. He does design, but he also writes HTML and CSS, and he wants to be able to run Docker, put his HTML and CSS in, see the changes and commit stuff and do merge requests and all that stuff. So he really challenged himself to learn that. And it's been a huge, it's a huge success story for him as a designer in order to do this stuff. And, in certain ways, he's just as nerdy as the rest of us developers are, and in other ways, he's not. But he was able to really get in there and do that. So, I know it's not for everybody, and part of my what I considered my challenge going into this is to kind of present things to you and to give you exposure to these things. But if it's not for you, I get it, and there are tools that would allow you to do that.
Yeah, and I'll speak to the DDev part of conversation. It was mentioned to me several times that maybe we should do a DDev meetup next time to compare the two.
Yeah.
DDev is mainly for local development only. And that's a very important thing. You can technically run DDev in production, but it's not recommended at all. So DDev is really utilizing the power of Docker to easily configure your local environment and then also share that same environment with everybody else too. So if you have other people in your team, and DDev does a great job of allowing you to configure your servers as well. So if you're running Apache or Nginx, you can go into the comp files, you can manipulate, you can really set it up to mimic your production environment very specifically and very easily just using the configuration files that it provides. But it's not meant for production. If you're going to utilize Docker in production and all the containerization that comes with that and everything else you can do, you're going to be looking for more of, I guess, a manual setup, if you will, like TJ's presenting today. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but DDev is really focused on PHP development. So really the LAMP or the LIMP stack, you're not, if you're doing some other development or something and you want to utilize Java or like a Java environment or something like that you're doing in production with Docker, you're not really going to utilize DDev. So that's really DDev comes into play. It is super easy to use. I love it as my local environment. It's super fast, super easy to manage. But there's different use cases for where you're going to use Docker, and then where you're going to use DDev for that. So
yeah, and just speaking a little more to the CLI fear, or maybe fear is not the right word, but I'll use it for me because that when I started out developing, 2003, 4, was just fiddling with it at the time. I didn't have a job doing it, but I considered myself an HTML guy and a CSS, and then quickly picked up CSS to add to HTML. And I didn't like the terminal. I didn't want to use the terminal. And then people would be like, oh, just type this in the terminal. I didn't understand what it was doing. But I challenged myself. And of course, now I'm a PHP developer. I'm writing like back-end code and all this stuff. And I just challenged myself. And the first way I started doing that was, hey, you really should start learning some of these CLI tools because they're really useful and beneficial. And again, I'm not, you can have an entire career without the CLI. I know people who do it and they do it well. And you can use tools. I can't remember. Was it CodeKit I used to use to compile front-end assets and, just stuff like that. Like you can certainly have an entire career. I know people who spend their entire careers building WordPress sites and literally just slapping themes in there. And there's people who build Squarespace sites and have an entire career doing it. So what I'm presenting is sort of my path. And if that's not your path, that is totally great.
Awesome job, TJ. So as Tom appears here for us, we are almost at 11:30. So if you have any more questions on Docker, definitely ping TJ. Hang out and chat. I know TJ has to head out around noon or a little before noon, but feel free to continue to ping him. He's always in the community, always very helpful. Yeah. TJ, thank you for this today. I'm sure after we all watch this presentation 3 or 4 times in half speed, we'll eventually figure out how to do this in Docker. But yeah, I mean, I know you've been doing it for a while, and you bring a lot of insight to this and a lot of helpful insight. Obviously, as people look at Docker, they see what it is, globally, but you're able to really bring it down to what matters to the EE community and how to use it. So
yeah, I hope
really appreciate your time and experience.
Yeah, no problem. I was really glad to do it. I'm going to jump off video and audio, but I'll still be here to hear what Tom has to say. So
awesome, sounds good. So with that note, we do want to transition to Tom Yeager from the EE team. Tom Jager, sorry, Tom, from the EE team there. Excited to have him. Excited to hear what ExpressionEngine is going to be working on here as we start 2023. I know it was exciting to see Coilpack come out into open beta. If you haven't jumped on that, I'd highly encourage you to check that out. And we're going to start seeing that show up in the wild here and there. But other than that, I'm actually going to introduce Tom, and then I've got to run to a meeting. So I think Lydia is going to close things out for us in a minute. But thank you, Tom, for joining us. Thank you for all you do for the community and all that you've done for ExpressionEngine over the last few years. I know it's been exciting to see where you brought it to, and I'm excited to see all the excitement that we've seen in the wild about ExpressionEngine. A lot of people have been coming back and talking about ExpressionEngine and just talking about where it's going and wanting to get back into the community. And we're excited about the growth, and I really think that's all because of you and the team. So excited to hear from you today. And I will see you guys later.
See you, Andy. Thank you. All right, right off the bat, can people hear me all right? All right, awesome. So I gotta ping 2 things here before we get started. Right off the bat, Andy, we had recorded a video, Andy and I, but we didn't end up releasing it for a bunch of different reasons. But Andy, you played no small role in where ExpressionEngine is today. So, thank you. Thank you for all of your effort and contributions on so many fronts. Similarly, the EECA, continually putting out these events, the conference, valuable material. It's awesome. So thank you. And I gotta call it TJ. I think one of the things that really rang true watching this presentation today was this is a really good groundwork and example of Docker and a walkthrough. It's definitely building a baseline knowledge on so many fronts. So, and Docker is a very important technology in our industry today. So, thanks for taking the time to put that together. I know it's no small effort. I will watch that video again, and I'm sure many other people will as well. So thank you for that. All right, so we'll jump in. A couple of quick updates here. So one right off the bat, Coilpack is in beta. It is not something we have pushed super hard. We did do a blog post about it. There will be more on that. If similarly along those lines, if you haven't checked it out yet, we did a 2-part podcast with Solspace. A lot of that was around Coilpack, state of ExpressionEngine. It was also the first time we ever shared the story of actually acquiring ExpressionEngine publicly. So we've had a lot of great feedback on those podcast episodes. So I would encourage people to check those out. It is in beta. We are still on track for a Q1 launch of a non-beta version. We are excited for it. We will be pushing Coilpack more. When I say pushing, I really mean kind of advertising, making it known, putting out more video materials. Some other interviews are lined up, things along those lines as well. So we're excited for that. One of the questions we get right off the bat is, do you have to use Coilpack? The answer is no. For those who don't know, Coilpack is, from a high level, a decoupled architecture that you can install alongside ExpressionEngine. So you don't have to use it at all. If you don't need it, there's no reason to use it. But what does it do? It brings things like Twig support, Blade support, GraphQL, and REST to ExpressionEngine, and ultimately a whole lot more than that, which we'll dive into in another session, if you will. All right, so feel free to drop questions. We'll take questions here at the end as well. A couple quick updates, things that are cooking. ExpressionEngine 7.3 is nearing code completion at this point. We are aiming to release sometime in Q1. That's really going to be released when it's ready, if you will. And when it's ready for 7.3 isn't just from a code and product stability. It's really from documentation, supporting materials in the forms of videos or tutorials as well. So we are excited for that. What's in 7.3? So there is something that we call fieldlets that is coming in 7.3. What are fieldlets? Fieldlets is bringing field groups to the existing fluid field. So what does that mean? It means literally any field group you create, and a field can be in more than one field group, can now be tied to a single fluid field element. So you could say something like add new fluid field element, three tiers of pricing, and you'll get all the fields, boom, in the field group that are needed for the kind of standard 3 pricing tiers type of setup, if you will. So that's a big one. We're excited about that. Another one is community requested here was the auto incrementing of channel titles. So people may remember in ExpressionEngine version 2, you had auto incrementing URL titles specifically. So if you had blog entry 1, and then you had another entry called blog entry 1, the URL title would auto increment. That's a bad example because it would auto increment to 1, 2. But I think you get the idea. Basically, don't force them to be unique. Ultimately, it was requested to have more fine control around how to make URL titles unique. We felt like, hey, you know what? This was a good option right off the bat. It is something that you can configure, so you can either turn it on or off, if you will. But at the very least, it will increment duplicate titles now. Similarly, cloning in 7.3 is going to take a big step forward. So many people remember that we rolled out entry cloning back in 6.2, I want to say, about a year ago. In addition to that, in 7.3, you're going to be able to clone channel fields, channel layouts, member roles, and categories. So we're kind of excited to roll that through the control panel. Similarly, we are opening up the entry manager to more columns to be added. Specifically, tab files for add-ons or tabs in a entry can now be pulled into the entry manager. Perfect example of that is something like transcribe. I assume publisher would be in the same boat. You can now easily show the language of a given entry. There's, structures, another one. You can actually show the URL of a given entry in the entry manager as well. So that's something we're excited for. We also have a search scope. So this is not pro search that ships with 7, but this is just straight up traditional search. There's several items that need attention in search. And there's like 5 or 6. I'm not going to call them all out, but we're aiming to get those all into 7.3 as well. I think the biggest one that's been requested is, I don't remember the exact release. Robin may remember. Maybe version 3 or 4, where tables got split. The search module did not account for the maximum number of joins that MySQL can support. So that is one of the things we're planning to have in the 7.3 release as well. Don't know if this next one's going to make it in 7.3 yet. It is actively in progress currently, but it's just straight up PHP 8.2 support. So that would really be the initial support of PHP 8.2 in ExpressionEngine. So that is in progress. Not 100% sure if that will be tied up with a bow on it at that point in time or not, but that is on the radar for 7.3. If not, it would probably be shortly thereafter. So that's a bit of an update about what we've been up to. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes that we're not quite ready to push out in 7.3 or ready to talk about in this context. But I do want to open the floor if there's questions or comments or things along those lines. Happy to stay on and answer some questions. That's a pretty brief update, but I feel like I monologue too, so I think there's a good bit in there. Hey, Lydia.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. Does anybody have any questions for Tom? You can put them in the Q&A. You can put them in the Q&A tab, or just come on in. Here. Oliver was asking for some, if you could explain the fluid fields update again.
Yep. So right now, when you configure a fluid field, for instance, you can choose to add, any field essentially that's in ExpressionEngine, and say, hey, this fluid field can use this as an option. In addition to that, you're now going to be able to choose field groups that are configured inside ExpressionEngine. So you can say, hey, this is going to be an option in fluid field. So then when you're publishing an entry, you would have an option, and it would effectively be that field group. So you could pull in an entire field group of 10 fields or something like that through one button click, quote unquote, for fluid fields. So it's really good for like component-based design. I know, for instance, TJ's example, he had a Tailwind UI component, if you will. You could have that component represented by 7 fields. Click the button, boom, here's all 7. So that's what's coming in 7.3 with the fieldlets. We call it fieldlets. I don't know if that'll stick or not, but.
Yes. Okay, now there's a whole bunch of questions coming in, and I'm trying to field them. Someone asked, Blair asked, who's replacing Andy, and somebody replied, Andy's irreplaceable. I think that's all of, I'm sure that's how we all feel. Let's see here. And somebody was asking if the fluid fields are similar to Neo or NEO and Craftworks. And do you mean it works similar to that? I don't know much about that functionality. I don't know if you do either, Tom. If you'd be able to.
I don't know a ton about Neo. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a great answer for you there.
And there was let's see here, let's see here. Oh, then there was a question from Melissa about the EE conference. And yes, there is going to be, it's more of a mix this year with the summit style and some other types of presenting, but there is a limited number of participants again. So yeah, we took the feedback that we got to heart for that to try to keep it in a similar format. So yes, please, this will be my chance to plug the conference again. There's going to be, it'll be a lot of fun in Orlando, and so please get your tickets. Take advantage of the early bird. Anybody else have any questions for Tom? I think I got.
I will mention too that everything I've heard about the conference, the summit style this past October was just amazing. So, and I thought so as well. It was a very tight-knit group. I felt like a lot of relationships built, but also a lot of depth business-wise for people. So it was really, really good.
Good. Awesome. Well, does anybody else have any questions for Tom since we've got him here? Okay. Well, I'm sure you can put him. It's really great to hear all the positive feedback about the conference. That makes us feel good. Oh, great! TJ just put a link into his slides, which is fantastic. And yeah, thank you also, TJ. So yeah, with that, I guess Tom, you'll probably be here for a couple minutes in the chat while I wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming on, and we love hearing from you and getting these updates, these insights into the direction of EE. And everybody be sure to check out that podcast. That sounds really awesome.
And thanks for having me.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to try to share these slides. Let's see how this goes. Okay. So let me just see here. All right, I got it, I think. So yes, thank you very much. Thanks for bearing with me here while I got the technical stuff sorted out. We really enjoyed having you guys here. Thanks so much for participating. We want to thank our awesome sponsors again: Hop Studios, Triple Nerd Score, Greenline Creative, Creative Arc, Jub, Prime Incorporated, Conflux, BuzzingPixel, Noble, and Bold Minded. And last but not least, Eric with Mithra 62, is a Friends of EE. This is a volunteer organization. Please, if you feel like it, we're always up for donations to help support all of our endeavors here. And you can do that on the EE conference website. And as we mentioned, we've got a lot of fun stuff coming up. We have a March virtual meetup, and we'll get that information out to you guys pretty soon about when that's going to be. Same with the spring conference, that's also coming up. We're really excited about that. And then, of course, the fall summit, October 4th and 5th in Orlando. Please sign up, take advantage of the early birds while they're still here. And we look forward to seeing you all there.